everyone. Thanks for coming to the HRF seminar. I'm going to introduce the speaker today. Hopefully you can hear me, but I'll try to talk very loudly. We're welcoming David Larson, who's a senior research fellow of the Library of Arabic Literature here at NYU Abu Dhabi. His translations of classical Arabic poetry have appeared in the Cambridge Literary Review, the Denver Quarterly, A Public Space, and the Brooklyn Rail. And his translation of The Names of the Lion of Ibn Khaldun from Wave Books received the 2018 Harold Morton Landon Translation Award from the American Academy of Poets. His second book of poetry came out in December 2022 from Penning Editions in Chicago. Its title is Heroes for Hollow. David is a clinical associate professor of liberal studies at NYU in New York City, and he's here today to discuss his project for the Library of Arabic Literature under the title Desperate Characters, Jamil Buthaina and His Translator. Welcome.
Thank you for all. I must stand. I can't stand. I can't remain seated. For this, glad to be here. Grateful to you all for coming. Glad for the opportunity to explain what I'm doing in my office across from the restroom where I'm very popular. I'm editing the collected poems of Jamil Buthaina and translating them for the Library of Arabic Literature. I'll be introducing you today to Jamil Buthaina, someone that a lot of you already know as a romantic figure out of legend, if not as a poet. But this isn't just about literary appreciation. If you're not a stakeholder in poetry per se, if you consider this a meditation on how to engage rationally with someone who is half legend, and also to consider the recovery of their archive, which is something we can all get behind. Before I begin, I want to thank someone who's here. Marwan Abdulhamid is a major in computer science here at NYU Abu Dhabi, and Marwan was working in the NYU Art Gallery when I went in to get a shot of our illustration for, it was in the Khalid Modern show. And I was like, oh, this is gonna be great for Jamil. And Marwan goes, you do know that that's an illustration of the Mu'allaq of Imru al-Qais, don't you? And I was like, oh, yeah. No, it's you can see it faintly there. It's line 14, where Jamil. Imru al-Qais boards this woman's camel, and she goes, Akarta ba'iri ya Imru al-Qaisi, fanzili, get off of the camels, you're going to break its back. So thank you, Marwan, for sparing me the embarrassment. Still a good shot, though, and in case you wonder why she looks annoyed, that's because of the verse. So, to begin the real talk, our introduction begins with, well, it's a basic fact. The identifying surnames of most Arab poets in the 1st and 2nd centuries of Islam came from their tribes. But there was a group of love poets known by the names of their beloved. These include Quthayr Azza, Qais Lubna, and Majnun Layla, who's the most famous, albeit a fictional person. But the first of all these was Jamil Buthaina. I call these love poets because Ghazal, in other words, Nasib, in other words, amatory verse, was the branch of poetry they excelled at and are remembered for. And inevitably, this is how we will promote the Jamil volume when it's finished, inshallah. And if we're smart, we will find some pop culture tie-in, like this televised dance performance from 2019. The story tells itself. Jamil loved Buthaina, who was his cousin, 5 times removed. But their match was opposed by her family, and with this refusal to accept any other love object, there begins a new kind of heroism in Arabic poetry. You could call Jamil the Islamic world's first rebel against arranged marriage. I'm not going to insist on that, but it would be borne out by the stories about Jamil. But the poetry, which is why we're here, or why I'm here, is more like a one-sided conversation with Buthaina. full of reproach, and not just for her family either. Your first taste of Jamil comes from the dictations of Abu Ali al-Qadi, the poem in Tawil meter beginning فَلَوْ أَرْسَلَتْ يَوْمًا بُثَيْنَةُ تَبْتَغِي يَمِينِي وَلَوْ عَزَتْ عَلَيَّ يَمِينِي. My right hand is dear to me, but if Buthaina would send me a message requesting it, the messenger can have it. I'll give it freely and say, if the hand's not enough, there's my capital. Just ask for it, Buthaina. That's how to spot the real miser. Why not ask me when tales are brought to you about how bad I do in your absence? Let me be clear, or bring a righteous witness to the wrong they do me. Buthaina is dear to me, but Buthaina, our union, unsever it, please, is something I'll never cry out. I have been warned they're out to spill my blood over you. I wish they'd try it. But when they see me coming, they're like, oh, who's this? And these men know me. Not exactly Valentine material. So even with Valentine's Day just less than a week away, I'm going to highlight some other aspects of Jamil's corpus and my work as his editor and his translator, which is unromantic in the extreme. Because let's face it, textual criticism is not the hottest thing around. Mostly we think of it as the grunt work that has to be done before interesting scholarship can begin. And I am not going to push back on this. I am not supposed to have a critical take on Jamil. My job is to allow readers to create their own relationships to the work. What I have is an editorial take, which I'll outline today along these three temporal planes. First, we have Jamil's native milieu. That's Western Arabia in the 1st century of Islam, corresponding to the 7th century of the Common Era, the so-called Common Era. Then there is, number 2, the period where we get it in writing. And this would be the 9th century to the 12th, roughly equivalent to the Abbasid period, where most of my sources come from. And then finally, our own time, the 21st century here and now. Sheldon Pollock is a scholar of Sanskrit texts, and he calls this philology in 3 dimensions, which is a grand phrase. I think of it more modestly as philology of the longue durée. But it is true that editors and translators have to be mindful of all these temporal aspects, and that's what will structure today's talk. But the 20th century is important also, because I am not working in a modern vacuum. Now, in English, there is not much Jamil out there, so no story either. But the 20th century editions of his poetry in Arabic could be a talk in itself. And this list probably isn't even complete. Out of these editors, I will highlight Hussein Muhammad Nassar, the editor of Diwan Jamil Shi'r al-Hub al-Udhri. I don't say he's the one to beat because this book will never be outdone. I get to sit in my office all day and just download PDFs. Dr. Nassar worked from unpublished manuscripts of little-known anthologies, did amazing detective work, and the result is just the most complete and rationally organized edition of Jamil's poetry there is. I would have no hope of charting Jamil's archive without it. Let me also acknowledge Francesco Gabrielli, whose 1939 edition I depend on mainly as a numbering system. So thank you, 20th century. So now, instead of jumping all the way back to Jamil's day, we'll start with the second dimension. That's Jamil's reception in manuscript. So you'll see why it's a special case. I'm going to read to you from the website of the Library of Arabic Literature. The Library of Arabic Literature makes available Arabic editions and English translations of significant works of Arabic literature with an emphasis on the 7th to the 19th centuries. You'll notice it doesn't say modern anthologies or compilations or chrestomathies or samplers of Arabic literature. LAL expects the editor to begin with an asl, that's to say a primary text that was composed or compiled no later than a couple hundred years ago, give or take. Well, guess what? This excludes Jamil. of this hugely important and popular Arab poet, recited by every classical Arabic philologist and critic of poetry. We do not have a classical era diwan, that is a volume of his collected poems from the Abbasid period. Here's some examples of what I mean. 3 Umayyad poets and the Abbasid scholars who stabilized their diwans to create authentic Asli texts, any one of which would make an excellent LAL volume. I don't mean to slight these poets. They are names to conjure with among connoisseurs of classical Arabic poetry, but none of their fame compares to Jamil. The names in blue are for hipsters only, and some of you know about me and Abu Nasser in the middle. Elderly bachelors are my specialty. Now, compared to these, we have the Diwan of Majnun Layla, whom I mentioned. Also compiled in the 9th century by someone named Abu Bakr al-Walidi, whom nobody knows anything about. There is a tribal group called the Banu Waliba. That's a Banu Waliba al-Hadith, Ibn al-Hadith. That's a branch of the Banu Asad. And there's a place in Azerbaijan called al-Waliba, but after that, the trail goes cold. So I don't know how many of you looked at it. This diwan would be an editorial ordeal, because it is a tissue of verses by other Umayyad era poets, all collaged together. Every time you search on a verse, which is a good strategy, it comes up, oh, this is by Nusaib or Al-Ahwas or Omar or Jamil himself. A lot of the Diwan of Majnun Layla comes out of Jamil's work. The text is a legitimate survival from the 9th century to our time. So I give her credit, but anyway, we don't have this for Jamil. So what did happen with Jamil's Diwan, I wish I knew. The bibliography of Ibn Nadim, which dates securely to a single year, which is to say the year 987 or 8 of the common era, he lists 2 books of Akhbar Jamil, reports of Jamil, one by Ishaq ibn Ibrahim al-Mawsili, and another by al-Zubair ibn Bakkar, who used Ishaq as a source. Both of these are very important people. Al-Zubair, for reasons I will explain. And then we have evidence, another bibliography from the 12th century. This is the Fahrasa of Ibn Khair al-Ishbili, coming out of Seville, who gives a catalog of all the texts that Abu Ali al-Qali brought to Cordoba when he emigrated to Al-Andalus in the year 942. And these books include the poetry of Jamil in 1 volume. So for this part of the talk, I prepared this whole elegiac finish because I thought it was our last glimpse of the Diwan of Jamil. I still can't resist. Politically, that always seems to be like time travel, you know, like Abu Ali leaving Abbasid Baghdad to go back to the Umayyad period in Cordoba, taking Jamil's Diwan with him into the Western lands. But instead, I have to issue a correction to the announcement to today's talk, which said that Jamil's Diwan was compiled and lost in the Abbasid period. And let me just say, any talk I give, there's inevitably a correction of what I said just like last week. So last week, I was minding my business. Poor Peter came by my office. I must jump down your throat to tell you this. I was reading As-Suyuti's commentary on the Mughni al-Labib of Ibn Hisham al-Ansari, where I find, oh, I have seen this verse in Jamil's Diwan. And As-Suyuti, look at his dates. He's late Mamluk. A little digging around on Shamla, and I find Abdul Qadir al-Baghdadi saying, this is how it appears in Jamil's Diwan. So now what? At face value, I gotta say, I'm conflicted. On one hand, okay, yeah, maybe it was possible to lay eyes on the Diwan in the 17th century. And this makes me irate because I only missed it by 300 years. But there are reasons also for suspending judgment. The statement of Abdul Qadir, that's not quite an autopsy. It doesn't say Rahitu fi Diwani, which As-Suyuti does. So it could be a metaphorical Diwan he's talking about. I'm also never sure whom Abdul Qadir is quoting. And Asayuti, I love Asayuti, but it is very easy to catch Asayuti in false attributions. I'm sorry. And maybe some of you have found this. As a Hadith scholar, I do not fault him. That would be a serious charge. But in strictly literary matters like this, I'll just say he can be creative. And there's a bald-faced example of this coming up. So anyway, now just to conclude this part of the talk, if a manuscript of Jamil's Diwan, if it were to surface tomorrow, I would rejoice. But yeah, I would wipe out a lot of the work that I'm doing. But I'm not conflicted about that. You know, my loyalty would be to the archive. So what am I actually doing all day? I am following in the footsteps of Hussein Masad, who adduced some 870 verses of Jamil from tradition at large. That's partly why I picked Jamil, because that's not too many verses. And to these, I've added only around 40 more from the tradition at large. As currently conceived, the volume is in 4 sections here before you. So now you see the editorial challenge. Library of Arabic Literature wants one text to serve as the asl, the foundational text, but which one? In December at the board meeting, it was suggested that the long poems in Muntaha al-Talab could be the asli text. And I think I did a good job of disguising my horror at this, because I don't know if you've spent much time with Muntaha al-Talab, but it is, I love it because it does exactly what I promised not to. And that is to Frankenstein these long poems together out of shorter fragments, which is easy to do. If it has the same rhyme and the same meter, then go to town. And every modern Jamil editor does this, including Hussein Masad, including Francesco Gabrielli, but they at least showed their work. Other people just kind of do it and hide it. So what do? I'm committed, that is, to presenting the archive as is. So when the archive itself includes that kind of collage artistry, you have to include it. It is important historical evidence that the 12th century supply of Jamil's poems exceeded demand. And this is disclosed in Ibn Maymun's title, which Muntaha al-Talab min Ash'ar al-Arab, which literally means ultimate satisfaction of the demand for poems of the Arabs. So that is quite a lot about tradition. Now, for Jamil's own day, which is the temporal plane we're all curious about, let me paraphrase what Taha Hussein says, a very perceptive essay of 1924. Taha Hussein was a poetry scholar, not a historian. But in what follows, he gets just about everything right, as far as I can tell. To begin with, ghazal poetry, love poetry, where the poet abandons all the other themes of the qasida and really just sticks to the amatory theme. That arises in the Hijaz, in Western Arabia, in the generation after the Prophet and his companions, in the time of the Tabi'een, who followed after. So in the first century of Islam, we see 2 contrary movements in this area. On one hand, you have the migration of political power northward to Damascus. On the other hand, there's a massive inflow of capital into the Hijaz. So what results from this is an urban culture of leisure and luxury and political disaffection, which gives rise to the song culture that takes off in the first century. Historians of music do not contest this received outline. If anything is not well enough appreciated, that Mecca and Medina were the cradle of Arab Islamic musical tradition, song culture. But Jamil is not from the city. Jamil's tribe is based outside of Medina in a place called Wadi al-Qura. The tribe of Udra is famous more for poetic reasons than historical ones, commemorated here in Nathaniel Mackey's 1993 poetry collection, School of Udra. I can't resist reading the first little bit. Came dawn, the pigeons cooed Arabic under the eaves outside their window. It's very sharp, and some of you know what I mean, that the Arabic verb for the cooing of the dove is saja'a, and this is the root of saj, which is the discursive medium of the pre-Islamic soothsayer and the orator, and eventually the Quran itself is revealed in the medium of saj. Nate Mack is on fire. By the way, he's now teaching at Duke University. And that's some presentism for you. I'd like to say, and now back to the historical tribe of Udra, but that is hard to do. The Udris are early converts to Islam, but they're not major participants in the Maghazi, which is to say the expeditions carried out in the Prophet's lifetime. They were at Tabuk, and as you know, that's the one that never happened. In the subsequent conquests, the Futuh al-Buldan, their name just doesn't come up. And in later periods, please put it in the chat if you found this, but I do not find al-Udri as a tribal surname. Instead, what we get are these ahistorical anecdotes, like this bit from Ibn Qutayba, which is typical. I'll read the part in yellow. An Udri was asked, "What tribe are you from?" Mimananta. He says, "I come from a people who, when they fall in love, they die." And then a girl in her answer says, "By the Lord of the Kaaba, this is an Udri." I love it. It's a great story. It obviously belongs in the volume. But a whole tribe of tender-hearted lovers is not a viable kinship group. And even Taha Hussein mythologizes here a little. This is where I step off, because he says that in distinction to the frivolous, lush life of Mecca and Medina, the Bedouin of the Hijaz embraced a proto-Sufi kind of renunciation, which I'm skeptical about. I mean, poverty I believe in, but a voluntary asceticism at the level of a whole tribal group is hard to swallow. So there's no question that my work's cut out. It will be difficult to rehistoricize the tribe of Udra. One thing I can say is that the tribe is distant from this nascent song culture in Mecca and Medina. Early on, like in the decades after his death, the generation of Ibn Muhriz, Jamil's poetry was taken up as a source of song texts. Oh, and there's another great one. You know Jamila, the singer? There's a whole anecdote about, oh, I met Buthaina and I got to ask her this and that, right? But I didn't meet Jamil. So in any biographical report of Jamil, I've yet to find any mention of musical performance. And that's unlike his contemporaries. Let's just name the great Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a at Mecca, who, unlike him, Jamil doesn't show up at wine-soaked parties. So if you want to know how Jamil liked to party, here's another poem from Kitab al-Adhan, a 13-liner in Khafif meter. The name in this poem, Jusayr, this is Buthaina's sister. And if it seems like she's the love object, Al-Ahani tells us this is so. Before his poetry was dedicated to Buthaina, Jamil wrote poems to her older sister. Do without what you can. The translation I'll read is unruly still. I've got more discipline to impose later, but the first line goes like this. Rasmidarin wakaftu fi talale, kintu aqdil ghadata min jalale. I've stopped at so many of these campsites and grieved my life away until the dawn. Desolate, abandoned, where you see no one but winds that weave the sands till they're flat and smooth, and leaves of grass all wilted, and upright spheres of juncus where the water went, between the heights of Wabish and Bulai and Al-Ghamim at the foot of its mountain, when you halt at Jusayr's abode and lose all afternoon there. All my companions, when the water seekers near to parching, Jusayr is a meadow full of plants whose names I haven't translated yet, irrigated by the springtime rains. Now, while these maids were at Aladek, there appeared to them a rider on a camel. Their hearts went out to him. Be hospitable, they told her. At his guest feast, you'll be honored. So I was made comfortable and reclined at ease and drank not illicit beverage, shrib mal halela, out of goblets. I should probably refrain from telling a friend about it, even one from whom I fear no injury, not for antisocial reasons or resentful ones. I worry about him resenting me. Many's the friend whose closeness I once enjoyed, and many's the friend whose noise I had to walk away from. Alas, but before we walk away from the poem, let me show how it's introduced in the Aghani. Al-Zubair said, that's Al-Zubair ibn Bakar, whom I mentioned earlier. In the original report of this poem, the narrator gave only 2 verses. The rest of it was recited to me by someone I've never heard of. This Buhlul ibn Sulaiman, that's not the well-known Buhlul, the madman of Kufa in the 8th century. No, this is a contemporary of Al-Zubair, who died in 870. And that's more than 150 years after Jamil. Now, if it seems to you that some latter-day rhapsode, perhaps Buhlul himself, made up this poem after the pattern of the 2 verses that were in the early report, you are awake to the fact that tradition, which was Sheldon Pollack's second dimension, that's not just metatext. Tradition, in the case of Jamil, generates more text, as it does with many other poets. Now, under certain circumstances, we call this midrash, where interpretation of the text happens by retelling it and expanding on it, usually in order to enforce some allegorical reading, but that's not what we have here. This is more basic. It's just dissatisfaction with the fragment and desire for completion. And as Jamil's editor, I know the feeling, but here is another place where presentism comes in. I think there is in our day more appreciation for the incomplete, more willingness to let a fragment be a fragment. And there better be, because this volume is going to have some straight up one-liners. At the same time, I'm not going to try to undo the work of Takmil that went on in the Abbasid period, or try to restore anything of Jamil's to its original state. The form in which tradition gives it to me, I'll give it to the reader, with the caveat that dimensions 1 and 2 of our 3 dimensions of philology are impossible to separate. Now, in that spirit, I want to finish up with Al-Zubair and my attempt to historicize Jamil. The poet's tried, as I've said, is kind of a cipher, but how about its time and place? The Hijaz in the late 7th century. I think you see where this is going. The Hijaz, between the years 683 and 692, is the headquarters of Abdullah ibn Zubair, who declared himself caliph after the death of Yazid. Then from all the way up in Damascus, Abdullah's claim is contested by the Marwanid pretenders to the caliphate. First Marwan himself, and then his son Abdul Malik, and this is the second civil war of Islam. Anas and I have been talking about Ibn Zubair, and Nathaniel and I were talking about him too. And we wish we could say there's a groundswell of interest in this individual. His claim to the caliph looks a lot more legit than Abdul Malik's. He was said to be the first child born at Medina to Muhajirun, that's immigrants from Mecca. And that was 9 or so years before the Prophet's death, so he's considered a Sahabi. He commanded more followers than the Umayyads and more territory, including most of Iraq, Iran, and the peninsula. And he minted way more coins. Check it out. I don't know how famous this is, but this is a Zubayrid dirham stamped in Iran by Ibn Zubayr's brother-in-law, who was his governor of Fars. And oh, by the way, it includes the earliest inscriptive evidence for the name of the Prophet Muhammad, which you see on the obverse side there on the left. I mean, it just says Bismillah, Muhammad Rasulullah. Not an Umayyad coin. It's to the Zubaydids that we owe this innovation. And I'm holding this up. This came out of the free box upstairs. Check it out. There's an actual, like, for kids, all about Abdullah ibn Zubayr. So maybe there is a little well, I can't call this a groundswell, but this is not an antagonistic take on him. So, I'll just put that out there. Anyway. Yeah, I mean, I could go on. There is also this, that the whole time he was resisting the Umayyads, Abdullah ibn Zubayr was fighting off the Khariji's, which is like, sorry, but it's like the ISIS of the 7th century. We're very likely that we need a reconsideration of Abdullah. I swear this is the short version. And I bring it up to state the obvious fact that no one else has stated, which is that the historical Jamil cannot have avoided taking a side in this conflict. And by all appearances so far, it was the Zubayrid side. This is my hypothesis. And by the time my prosopography is done, by the end of the semester, hopefully, I think it will be apparent whose side Jamil was on. In later tradition, I'm finding that members of the Zubaydi family adore Jamil, including Al-Zubayr ibn Bakr, the author of Akhbar Jamil, who was a lineal descendant of Abdullah's brother, another brother, Mus'ab. That's why he's called Al-Zubayr. So I can't help wondering if Jamil was encoded as a Zubayrid figure or hero in the Abbasid period. There is, for example, a story about Marwan ibn al-Hakam, the future caliph, Marwan I, who began the war against Al-Zubayr, that back when he was governor of Medina, he called for Jamil's tongue to be cut out. And this also comes from Ibn Qutayba. It's repeated by everyone, and so is Jamil's couplet, Atani an Marwana bil ghaiba. Word reaches me that far away Marwan calls for my blood to be spilled, or my tongue docked. But camels are for getaways. I know how to make them step high, and I have the whole world for my refuge. I just fixed that just before I came in here. Now, this is right on the edge, right? It's invective against Rufinus family. That's one thing. Invective against a caliph or a future caliph. That's not what this is. So whoever put this together, Jamil himself held back. I don't call this hijab, I call this fakhr, which is self-praise. Still, it dramatizes some contretemps between Jamil and the Marwanids. And counterbalancing this is, because you got other sides, there's the biographical fact that Jamil's life ended in Egypt in the service of Marwan's son, Abdulaziz. There's even a poem in praise of Abdulaziz in Tarikh Dimashq, which would be Jamil's only political poem if it were genuine. So, hey, maybe he wound up reconciling with the Marwanids after the rebellion was put down. He wouldn't be the only poet to do that. But now here's another anecdote. And with this, I swear I'm done with the history. This is funny. Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik ordered Jamil to praise him in verse, where he says, no, what does he say? Anzil Farjas. So it's, just declaim some Raja's poetry. And he expects to hear himself praised. And the joke here is that Jamil disappoints him by declaiming fakhr. That's to say, praise of his own tribe. I am Jamil of the Krim Ma'ad, and this is also genealogical evidence for like where to fit the tribe of Kurda'a. Are they, anyway, it's all imbricated. But it's covered by the thing. The point of the anecdote is to say that Jamil never composed panegyric for anyone. وَلَمْ يَمْدَحْ جَمِيلٌ أَحَدٌ قَطْ. So, if you want to say that Jamil praised one of the Marwanids, here we have, this guy couldn't be more Zubaydi if he tried. Look at his name. Abu Abdullah Mus'ab ibn Abdullah ibn Mus'ab al-Zubaydi, right? The most aggressively Zubayrid name I've ever seen. And he's here in the 9th century saying, no, that's impossible. Jamil would never do that. It wasn't his style to do madh. Now, Ultimately, it will not be possible to disambiguate between textual evidence that Jamil was a historical Zubayrid partisan and the evidence that he was claimed as such by later tradition, because it's the exact same evidence, which returns us to my critique of Pollack about dimensions 1 and 2, which, to be fair, he anticipates in that 2014 article. But he also says, and I quote, that we cannot learn to read across the three planes of philology actively and simultaneously unless we fully disaggregate them. And this I call by my favorite word in Arabic. It's wahm. He's imagining things, because that's not how it works. That's not how it works with Homer. That's not how it works with the Bible. Even the Quran went through an editing process. What Pollack means by tradition is strictly commentary. And that leaves out a lot of traditional operations, both additive and subtractive. The Diwan of Majnun would be the limit case of what I mean, because that's a pure product of tradition. How are you going to tell me that there's a historical dimension to be disaggregated from that? So check me out, I had a thesis. Meanwhile, in the 20th century, in all the editions of Jamil by Gabrieli, Nassar, and the rest, the verses are disembedded from the prose frames in which tradition gives them to us, which are the tales and legends and critical pronouncements about Jamil in the Aghani and many other texts. And now these 20th century editions are part of tradition. In the present version of Jamil's Diwan, the LAL version, the verses will stay in their frames. And LAL is not the first to do this. In 2008, there was Martin Yagonak's translation of the same Aghani chapter I'm working on right now. Very helpful. Along with the biography of Jamil in Wafayat al-A'yan, where the prose and the poetry, they're published like together as an integral whole. And whether this is the way of the future, I don't know, but it is the way of the present. And about the present, there hasn't been enough of it in this talk, our third dimension. Partly because it means talking about myself as a language artist, which is embarrassing. But also because it involves the future. It's like predicting how Jamil is going to land when the volume comes out. I do have some suspicions about this. And if you're in the Q&A, perhaps we can talk about it, how the poetry will be received. I'm obviously not a disinterested party. I want the book to do well and be popular in a way that Yagonak 2008 is not. And one way to do this is to embrace house style at the Library of Arabic Literature. You ready for this? First of all, no square brackets. If the translator needs to insert something for the verse to make sense, with the Arabic on the facing page, it is on them. And that's like, Justin knows, right?
Yeah.
Morris knows. I mean, you're totally exposed as being a, whatever. Here's another rule, no footnotes. And if you see my work, you know that that's a major departure. Over half the names of the line is footnotes. I have a translation in the works of the Book of Rain, Kitab al-Matar, by Abu Zayd al-Ansari. And my footnotes have endnotes, right? But that is for an avant-garde readership, and they love that kind of thing. Library of Arabic Literature is going after a wider readership. I want to help them. And so I'm going to work within these, I don't know, are the constraints? It's almost like it's too much freedom. Discuss. I do have a strategy. It's very simple. And I'll tell you now, it's just more Buthaina. That's right. That's what the people want. They want Buthaina's voice, or at least a simulacrum of it. And the good news is that tradition gives us a lot of Buthaina, many, many akhbar, in which she's represented as Jamil's faithful and reciprocal lover, despite her marriage to what's his name, Nubai, I think. Anyway, in these reports, the motif is that Buthaina, this is great, it's like she's an unconventional beauty, which is to say that other men are bewildered by Jamil's attraction to her. And the usual punchline to this is where Jamil says, but if you could see her through my eyes, you'd understand. But here's a story from the text of Suyuti I just mentioned. Shawahid al-Muhim. Now, Suyuti says that the story comes from Al-Mubarrad. And this is false. In reality, he gets it from Ibn Asakir, from Tarikh Dimashq, which is a major source for Suyuti. He quotes it all the time. And if you go to Ibn Asakir, he has a whole chain of sources, and they don't say anything about Mubarrad, but whatever. Al-Mubarrad. Buthaina paid a call on Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, who gazed at her sharply and said, Buthaina, what did Jamil see in you when he composed all that poetry about you? And she goes, what do people see in you when they made you caliph? And Abdul Malik laughed and granted her petition. I'm grateful for the laughter because I agree, that's fabulism of the best kind. Instantly recognizable as the product of tradition. Jamil isn't even there. There isn't any poetry, but I'm definitely sneaking this into the volume. And more good news is that prose tradition is not our only source for Buthaina's speech. Because one of my favorite things in Arabic poetry happens to be Jamil's specialty. I'm talking about dialogue poetry. Qalat Buthainatu kada, wa qultu, wa qalat, etc. It's through this contrivance that the monologue is interrupted, which would otherwise, let's face it, be a very wearying one-sided conversation. These poems are lighthearted with lots of teasing, and they're close to my heart. So in the tradition of every poetry reading you've ever been to, I'll just say 2 more poems. And we're done. Now, first is from an anthology called Al-Ta'liqat wal-Nawadir by Abu Ali ibn Zakaria al-Hajari, existing only in a couple manuscripts, not well known. It's 5 lines long, in a meter called Basit. قالت بثينة لما جئت زائرها سبحان الرب الأولى ما كان أوهاك. Praise to the Lord in the highest, Buthaina said when I came to her. What's got into you? You promised me a secret visit, and promptly. My day's not complete until I see you. If you were held up by an accident or an illness or even some other friend, I could forgive. On the contrary, I said, it was illness that brought me here. She laughed and said, that's plain to see. If only your disease magnified your attractiveness, if it did, I'd want a double dose for me. Not bad, right? That's the pattern of the dialogue poems. Buthaina gets the last word. It's always saucy or salty, as we say in Arabic. So let me finish now for real with one more from Al-Khali's dictations. And this final word about Al-Khali, which I'm bringing back the slide. As I mentioned, Al-Khali goes to Cordoba in 942 with his load of books, including the Diwan of Jamil. But there was some mishap in Tunisia where half of the books got lost. So when he gets to Spain, he dictates from memory the contents of his lost books. And those dictations are our source for the poem. Abu Ali doesn't tell us his sources, only that Ibn Durayd, who was his teacher, approved his reading of it. Now, was this poem included in the Diwan? And the same question goes for the other one I read. Was that from the Diwan or a supplemental source? It's not clear. Also to observe, I was in Denver a couple months ago for Mesa, where I talked with Ali Hussein from the University of Haifa. Great conversation. Of one thing, he agrees with me about Muntaha al-Talab. And when I told Ali I was working on Jamil, he mentioned this poem as one of his favorites. It's the court case between Jamil and Buthaina. And it was uplifting because this is my favorite poem too, where the adversarial spirit of that one you just heard is taken to just absurd extremes. It's kind of long at 18 verses, but I can't resist. The first line goes like this, in the meter called Wafir. وَقُلْتُ لَهَا تَلَلْتِ بِغَيْرِ ذَنَبٍ وشر الناس ذو العلل البخيل. What you accuse me of is not a wrong, I told her, unlike the miser's way, which is collective harm. Let's go before two judges, one from my group and one from yours, impartial men and not unjust ones. I want one judge, she said, from my group only, lest slanderers hear our case and embroider on it. We went before the judge in his curtained chamber, a worldly man whose eyelids sagged, and said, whatever your decision, we will accept it. We trust you with adjudication of our case, which will be binding, so judge between us, as your temper and opinion dictate. I am slain, I told the judge, with no recrimination. Wrongs left unpunished will proliferate. Ask her when she'll make good what she owes me. Is grievance ever righted when it's unredressed? The plaintiff is a liar, she said, and a useless person. His abusive accusations go on long. Am I his slayer? Then where's my weapon? If I attack him, what fighting strength have I? Nor have I despoiled his capital. The court will find the alleged debt is owed to me. A ruling was up to the sentencer, whose legal views were soundly based. Bring forth your witnesses, he said. I said, God is our witness, the exalted king. The defendant's oath, and I will reach my verdict, ordered the judge, whose every verdict was just and fair. She gave her oath and said the case against her carried less weight than the skin around a date pit. When it was over, I could not help asking, our case was settled in my favor, was it not? Bufina knit her brows and said, you think you prevailed? You who prevail in nothing you do? And don't let them find you with me, lest I be bereft of you. A bereaved woman is no one to mess with. That's here.
David, I'm sure you're happy to take questions. I will just use my privilege as the moderator to just ask one very broad kind of opening. Since you mentioned the Pollock on translation, in a way, your whole presentation was kind of a response to this, but can you just say more about how all the unknowns that you are searching for, tribal unknowns, political unknowns, was he a partisan of Zubayd? You know, was the tribe full of starstruck lovers? You know, what do we know about them? I guess how it impinges on translation at the very technical level, how this, you know, helps you think about the line or doesn't help you think about the line. Maybe not just philosophically, but even kind of in the sort of mechanics of translation.
Excellent question. I'm not prepared. You know, for me, it's more about the mechanics of editing, you know, and that's to establish the Arabic text, which, as they say, that's half the job. So for me, that's where the history comes in. That's where tradition comes in. That's where the tribal past comes in, judging the authenticity of the verse. But for translation, once the text is established, that's a separate operation. That's it. But you're very perceptive to ask about the line, because I mentioned authenticity. Now, I mean, we're including material that is so not authentic, you know, and that's got to be okay. The kind of thing where the poetry contest between Jamil and Omad, or Jamil's at court with 4 poets, and the caliph says, "Describe the lion," and you know everybody does their thing. That's not real. But I spent a lot of time with the text, and I didn't come prepared to talk about this, but I do have, oh God, forgive me. Well, let me back up and say, I'm always consoled by this. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his PhD dissertation, you know, he had a whole PhD topic that he had to abandon. Sound familiar? He was trying to disambiguate between fragments of Democritus that were real and fragments of Democritus that were not real. And in the end, he was like, you can't do it. And, I can't say that's the founding moment of Nietzsche's whole philosophy, but, there's something to that. And I'm doing the same. However, I am crazy enough to think in some cases that I can find the real Jamil. Certain poetic features. There's a funny way that Jamil has of dividing the as well as you've seen, the Arabic verse is divided into two halves, two shutters, by the caesura. And Jamil, God bless him, there's this thing that it's a repeating thing that's not easy to do, I don't think, because you don't often see it. But in Jamil's corpus, that gets divided into three units of sense. And thinking rhythmically, like a drummer, it's like a triplet sort of. And that does enter into the line. Absolutely. Because I'll try to, how many features of the original can the translator bring in? It's always like process of elimination, but I can do triplets. So thank you for asking.
David, you started with actually the question. That was exactly where I was like the authenticity question. Maybe we'll get there. I had a picayune, very small thought. Obvious, I think, to the people who do Abbasid history, but Tarikh Madinat Dimashq is a smoking gun for pro-Umayyad stuff, as you were clearly know. But more to the point, I was thinking about that authenticity question because it came up like when we would work on Antara, like together when we did that. And there was this moment when I remember sitting there and we're like, this poem they were kind of the poems, the long poems that seemed kind of cooked. They were sort of, they seemed like a pastiche. You could almost see the seams. And I dare say, even in the anthology, the Van Gelder anthology, the Majnun Layla poem, which kind of is like the one fairly similar kind of verse, that actually, you can see it preserved in pieces elsewhere. That too is a pastiche of sorts. So that's kind of interesting. I think it's happening a lot. Clearly that's something. How do you see this kind of? As we go to authenticity on the basis of a line, of course, is this something about the way Jamil was preserved? Is it him as a poet? Is it something about, there are a lot of tantalizing things that you could ask about it. Like you could say some aspects of his survival was that he was kind of outside of canon, or first of all, we don't have the text. That could be one answer. Second, he could be, outside of the sort of the machinery that sort of, or never really ended up in that same sort of place in the Abbasid canonizing process and didn't have certain things done to him or more. But it still leaves open that kind of question of the size of poetic fragments. I think also on the authenticity question, certainly their content. I remember actually playing a game like this with my Persian professor where we sat and we read quatrains of Khayyam. And he did this game. Like he was like, this doesn't seem like the kind of image that Khayyam would sort of come up with, which is a really, and he was only quoting people who did it before. And I think Ali Dashti did it before Heshmet Moayed did it. But it's a common kind of philological game. And it often is about, like I was thinking about themes and motifs, like love as sickness, which kind of occurs. It's a very Abbasid theme. And it is not I don't know, Omar ibn Abi Rabia, we could kind of go try and find it. I'm not sure it's as common there. And of course, because it's something that gets invented, it's from somewhere else. So I was trying to think about that. Do you have any other tells beyond the sort of the verse? Certainly.
I do, if you want to hear.
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
Well, first of all, to back up, I mentioned Muntaha al-Talab.
Yeah.
Jamil is not a unique case in that anthology. It's huge. And you have these freakishly long poems by Aus ibn Hajjaj, just all these. So Jamil's not a unique case there. One thing I look for is stuff that like, okay, if you were gonna make up Jamil, it's obvious what you do. It'd be Rufina, my tears are flowing, and oh, and you're a miser. That's the horrible thing that he does over and over. So it's the stuff that stands outside of that that's like, that might be him. Like when he mentions other women's names, like what?
Yeah.
Jamil is talking about Jumal all of a sudden. Well, hey, that's or Jasad even. But you're asking about poetic features, and well, here's one. In these poems, where I'm like, gosh, I'm seeing a lot of this. The grammatical feature called ma masdariya, where instead of a verbal noun, give me an example. I'tizal, withdrawal. You can substitute ma i'tazala. And it makes it much more abstract because usually when you get the verbal noun, there's a like i'tizalihi, and then you know who's doing it. But you have ma i'tazala with the same meaning. It's very hard to tell who the agent is. Sorry, it's not very vivid, but it happens a lot in Jamil. Oh, here's one. It's very vivid. Is there an Arabic word for this? Adunatan? Anyone? It's a trope of, in Greek, it means something that can't be done. It's like a paradox, an impossibility. Okay, here's my mnemonic for it. Season ticket on a one-way ride. How do you get a season ticket on a one-way ride? Well, you don't. That's why it's a highway to hell in the song by AC/DC. Can we get the screen back actually? Is there a way to I'll go back to the first poem. This has I hope I'm right about this. Oh, such a good phrase that I have to translate in such a pallid fashion, like something in my absence. There it is. Second hemistich, fourth verse. أسأت بظهر الغيب لم تسليني بظهر الغيب. Oh my God, that's awesome. By the appearance of what is absent. If it's ghaib, it can't appear. And this is, I mean, if this is really, I mean, I guess this isn't like that exotic. I don't know. But for one thing, I don't think there's an Arabic, well, I should never say that. I don't yet know the Arabic name for this kind of trope. But that is terribly Jamil. I should have more examples. So those are things, that's just my own, my sniff test. If I'm dealing with real Jamil or not. A couple more things to say. If you were going to fake Jamil, it would always be the love poetry. It would always be Tashbih and Nasib. And so it's the stuff that's not that. In the Aghani, Hassan came up a minute ago. Hassan ibn Thabit's son, Abdul Rahman, says, oh, Jamil's the best at Hijab and Nasib in that order. That's to say, invective and then love poetry. And we hardly have any Hijab in the, so in the Muntaha, which I keep beating up on, oh my God, there's this great poem where he has this whole Hijab. I should have brought that in, but it's so hard to translate. Where he says, oh, you're one of these type whose mind is always on your flocks. You're really good at breeding animals, aren't you? And then he goes to like 10 lines where he's painting this whole portrait of this social type, which is a rustic type, like this uncultured shepherd. And it's amazing. And that is real. That I think that's a legitimate survival material in Muntaha, which is a very compromised source, as you say. So that's why I can't walk away from it. So those are some something like this. John. Zagoria has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really very interesting, fascinating, and a lot of fun. I suggested to you earlier that we should find a way to dramatize the presentation. You just nodded, so now I understand why. You had something on the And then you sleep.
If we
So
want.
I want to be the devil advocate here
Okay.
about Suyuti. Because you seem to fault him for like getting everything wrong. And this is a serious question about authorship and orality when it comes to classical Arabic poetry, right? So when Suyuti attributes two verses to Jamil Budayna, maybe wrongly, he did it in Shawahid al-Mughni. Shawahid al-Mughni was commentary of the poetry verses used by Ibn Hisham in his Mughni Levi. So he was like trying to be, this is what Ibn Hisham used, this is the kind of poetry Ibn Hisham used. Let me help you and give you like more context to this poetry where it's coming from. So, and of course, Suyuti can't get everything right because he's written like 200 books and started reaching to everybody around the planet. And they're like, you know, so yeah, so I think they're being hard on him. So he's not, and you suggested that it's not his expertise.
Oh, it's not a matter of expertise.
No, yeah, it's not his expertise, absolutely.
Oh,
So, but I
Chip
think
knows
that
what I'm
this
about to
also
say.
really, my point is what I wanna, what really I wanna emphasize is the fact that you might find this kind of false or dubious attributions in all Arabic poetries, especially the kind of this old, you know.
That is a well-taken caution, and especially with commentaries on the Mughni, which is very hard to tell who's citing whom.
Yeah, absolutely.
I completely agree.
So yeah. So
However,
I think
Suyuti is a special case, and I'm now going to. One thing about LAL, try again. I've been rejected, and one of the abandoned projects was his Diwan al-Hayawan, which is.
I have to finish my question.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
No,
So,
okay.
I know you're like you're into this, but I know nothing about it. So these are my questions. So I wonder, how do you put in perspective this Budayna story and poetry in terms of the transition, if there has been a transition between orality, you know, the role of the Rawat. I mean, the Rawat are really the men who created this poetry and who got to decide whom to attribute each poem to. So they had like a huge influential role in this like authorship drama that was unfolding over centuries. So how do you like choose and how you factor that into your collection of the selection or whatever you do on, how do you use that?
I'll tell you exactly what.
Yeah, that's it.
That's it.
No.
Redundancy. This volume is going to have redundancy. The same verse might appear multiple times. And this is a hobby horse of mine, you know, like that what we get in tradition are these kind of instantiations of poems that appear in multiple versions. And what do? Do you pick one? Do you suture it together? In my view, you do them all. Now that's kind of it's a lot of work. And it has yet to be established that there is a mass readership for classical Arabic poetry in translation. So I was committing to, you know, getting people to read multiple versions of the same translation is counting on a lot. But that's just my answer to you, Zakaria, that I don't distinguish. And if we get Ibn Asakir as the Umayyad leaning, I mean, Dimashqi local guy, then include that. And then if we get the Zubayr and Jamil, then include that. And, you know, a couple paragraphs in the introduction. And I do like to leave as many interpretive decisions up to the reader as possible. Suyuti, forgive me, because I can go very long on the subject. He's practically like Borges, you know, with false attributions. And sometimes it's playful. I'll only, my first editorial project, the first text I ever turned from a manuscript into an edition, is it's called Kitab al-Wadik fi Fadl al-Dik, which is the book that's in praise of the rooster and is very lavish. And at the beginning of this, he says, Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani wrote a treatise on the rooster, and I'm going to give it to you now with my additions. and so on. And it's a complete falsehood. He is absolutely taking the chapters on Dajjaj and Dik from Hayat al-Hayawan al-Kubra of Al-Damiri from 100 years before and repackaging it and disguising his tracks. And it's not subtle. It's like right there in ink and paper. So if I seem a little jaded about a Suyuti, and as I say, it's not going to hurt anyone. And I do not fault him as a muhaddis because I see no reason to.
I mean,
But I've seen him just it would be, honestly, he oversights Ibn Asakir. And if he says, oh, al-Mubarrid, it's just mixing it up a little. And you know what? I'll bet you anything next week, I'll be minding my own business and find it in al-Mubarrid. So I apologize in advance because Allahu Alam, I have no idea.
I said, so is definitely suspicious. All these books. Nobody likes it. So I agree.
Thank you, David. This is very insightful. I'm particularly sorry.
Are you feeling guilty about law policies now?
No, I'm not. I'm actually. This is a wonderful example of the concern you raised about sort of taking texts or sort of texts that weren't represented in the tradition, and sort of not just picking and choosing. So I think this is what you're doing, and actually what James Montgomery did with Antara is the opposite. It's not the culling of sort of here's the 21st century scholars. Here's what I think is my favorites, the pick and choose, which is sort of the this Victorian approach of this entire corpus. I'm going to take, my favorite 12 Jamil poems, and this is what I think is everything. Everything else can just be tossed by the wayside. But essentially, our sense was that initially, and this is sort of inside baseball, as it were, but initially was that we didn't want to do this kind of best of or sort of picking and choosing. So it's in this sense, and the idea was that text would come, LAL text would represent something that was from the tradition itself. And obviously, as you've shown, there was at one point the Akhbar Jamil, and so there's a sort of a detective work to sort of reconstruct as opposed to cutting out something that's already there. So I know a lot of people spoke about authenticity, but have you at this point, at this stage, sort of thought about how this might be organized in the text? Are you going to simply have 4 sections? I think is one Muntaha Talab. Here's the.
I'm really trying not to fall in love with any vision because LAL's editorial, it's said to be energetic, the interventions. Yes. So I'm really ready for many hands to go in. I'm going to deliver it in these 4 sections. Kitab al-Hani, Ibn Qutayba, Kitab al-Hani, Muntaha al-Talab, and then an appendix with all the rest. With the caveat that I still think Kitab al-Hani will be the asl. For this reason that, Ibn Zubair, Al-Zubair ibn Bakr is obviously a major source for Kitab al-Hani, and Ishaq's Akhbar Jamil was, a source for him. I mean, there's a isnad between these 2 men, and is it Joseph Hell who wrote the EI1 article on this that said, Encyclopedia of Islam, first edition, that says a major source for Kitab al-Hani were the individual books of Akhbar al-Shuara by Ishaq ibn Ibrahim. So I feel like with Kitab al-Hani, we're getting a kind of a late echo of these Asli texts that we don't have, even though they cite Ishaq and al-Zubair as oral sources. So that's my word. I'm really open.
Thank you, David. I'm so fortunate to be next to you. And look forward to
Level
your
1.
conversations.
That's right.
I have 2 very short comments. Was it Buthaina with Abdul Malik bin Marwan? The anecdote? Okay. And so first, it's Homs, not Damascus. The Umayyad Sufyanid branch was ending, and there was actually the illusion or the idea that Umayyad rule came to an end. And there was a moment of crisis, and only Homs was Umayyad at that point, and then they transitioned from the Sufyanid to the Marwan. And what's exciting is that they picked Marwan because he was old, because they wanted someone who projected authority, also piety, because of his way was so successful. So the choice of Marwan was because of this is from Snad.
Okay, good tip.
There is a detailed account in the Tabari. It tells us actually there was a fight, a very fierce fight within the Umayyad. But that's a minor thing. The other one is with the thing of the Malik. This can be located in two threads. One is a subgenre called the Wafidat al-Khalif. This is usually women of some authority, usually coming from, with the support of a tribal name or a family name or former wives of, powerful people. And they come to the caliphs, and the council with the caliph kind of has a political nature. And this was a very interesting subgenre because then you can critique a certain caliphate without threatening the legitimacy, without kind of denying all aspects. And Abdul Malik is one of them, for sure. There are so many anecdotes questioning his, many aspects of his rule. In the end, he's the one who destroyed the Kaaba. So there is even supporters of the Umayyads centuries later couldn't, forgive him, but he's legitimate. So this falls within these. It's interesting to think of her as a woman of authority because of the Millet culture, and I think that's the link to what that.
I'm so grateful because you've basically told me a genre of type scene, which is great. If it was between men, I would almost say that's asmad, right? Night chats. But obviously
this is very political.
Yeah.
It's usually, from the political camp that loses the women, powerful women, come and meet the victorious party. And they kind of criticize without threatening.
There's something else about that story. That's the short version in the Suyuti, and that's why I chose it. In Ibn Asakir, it's a little longer. And it says that an old woman, a woman advanced in years, in handsome clothes, whose beauty was not yet faded, came in. And then there's like an anagnorisis where it's like, oh, this is Jamila.
Yeah.
Jamila, Buthaina.
Usually they're older because age too is next to the caliph laughs or grants them some.
Well, last year I read an anecdote on Al-Asma'i, where the same thing happens in the same words. A woman came in handsome dress, really old, but she's, you could tell that it was the same phrase in the same order. And there's no anagnorisis there, no reveal. And they have this kind of poetry battle. And Al-Asma'i says, oh my God, you're better than me. And she says, thank you. That's, and then she rides away. And I'm like, oh my, now I'm wondering, is that Buthaina that was talking to Al-Asma'i, or is that just like the formulaic phrase for what I need to do is read a bunch more Wafidat al-Khalifa.
One question, because I asked my graduate students and they attend, and they're curious about something you told me about the kind of construction of the Majnun in Arabic. I know it's a big topic, but maybe if you can just give us a sneak peek and tell us if you're going to be working on it.
I must confess that I mentioned elderly bachelors. That's one of my specialties. Another is Tales of Madmen. Absolutely. I translated the whole section on madmen who were poets from Iqt al-Farid of Ibn Abd Rabi. And also Ukala al-Majanin of Nisaburi. I can't get enough of these madman tales. I mentioned Bahlul. Those are prose tales. I mean, yeah, they have poetry in them, but to call them madmen is a little strange because they're more like urban eccentrics. Okay, sometimes they're in asylums. There's like one that takes place in an asylum, at least one. Where's the story going? Majnun is different because he's not Udri, he's Amiri, but whatever. He's just often the nudged. With him, you would have to say that's proto-Sufi asceticism. And hey, by the way, I mean, the poems of Jamil and Majnun do become the blueprint for a lot of Sufi imagery. Because that same refusal to accept any other love object, that's the Sufi, that's Tawheed. That's just like, I love the Lord and no one else, like that. But, as far as how the corpus of Majnun is constructed, now I remember, I do have a total suspicion. And then it's Kuthayir Azza that we mentioned, who was Jamil's Rawi, that's to say his rhapsode, a professional performer, a performer of Jamil's poetry. So that would be, another bottleneck, that the poetry we have of Jamil's must also have been repeated after him by Kuthayir. Now, Kuthayir is also responsible in his asmar, in his night chats with Abdul Malik, I'm sure, or some of the Umayyads. He's responsible for the basic outlines of the Majnun story. Like the story, we all know this one, right? Guy's out in the desert. Kuthayir says, I went out in the desert and I saw a man who had a trap set for a gazelle. A gazelle falls into the trap. And the guy says, he lets her go. And then Kuthayir goes, what did you just do that for? And he says, because she reminded me of Layla. And he delivers these 2 lines of poetry about Layla and her beautiful eyes. And those lines wind up in Majnun's Diwan. And they're in all this, Nizami, who has the Layla Majnun, right? That story's in there twice. And it starts with Kuthayir. So yes, thank you for asking. That is Kuthayir is a really important character in all, not just a character, but another historical poet. And he was regarded as kind of a madman, not a madman, but an eccentric, certainly.
Sorry. But are these people not only mad in love, and not mad, period? Most of them are actually.
The Ukala al-Majnun? Yeah, no.
He's mad because he's mad in love.
True. But then you get people like Juayfiran or Muwaswas, right? Who are just, they also play this role of being truth tellers.
Yeah,
but I'm sure you're right that if there's an origin tale, and yet Anisaburi has a madman and it's totally medicalized, where he's Mirra, one of the humors. Is it the yellow bile or the black bile or whatever? It's one of the humors that if you have too much of it, you whoop. And there's just a monologue where I forget which madman, but he's like sitting on top of a grave and he's apostrophizing his own mirra. That's very medicalized. I don't call that like love. So on the whole, I think yes, it's from erotic disappointment that men go mad. But there are alterations to the pattern. Maybe Justin, you know.
No, just very, very quickly. I know we're pressed for time at the moment, but I'm curious about, this is a historical question, poets who were pro-Zubayrid, who made their living through the rest of the Umayyads, were able to get through this period, right? Because I've run into, this guy who cropped up in the UC as a cited anecdote, Ismail ibn Yasa, who also has the same fate. He basically ends up mocking the Marwanids into their faces through a clever ploy. But I'm just wondering, now that it seems to be a trend, I'm wondering if there's a whole group of them, if anybody has worked on this. And what do you do if the Zubayrids are being your patron for 10 years in Medina, and then, and then they lose out, the Hajjaj comes down, and Abdul Malik washes his hands at the Kaaba saying, it wasn't me, it was Hajjaj. And then you have to go, there's no other game in town. So do you know, is there like a whole group of poets who have to make their way through the later Umayyad period?
I got a real short answer. Talk to Nathaniel Miller. Nathaniel could give you names and quotes of people, and maybe also Sam Winter's dissertation would.
So there's that, and then so I've made a little list of them.
Sam Wilder, sorry, not Sam Wilder.
Started working for the Umayyads after the war.
Okay.
Yeah. They mostly would try and go and work for the court again after supporting the Zubayrids. So.
One final question.
Yes, I have a final question about how al-Udri. You discussed the al-Udriyin, and this today when we talk about how al-Udri, we refer to them to refer to platonic love. And the poetry you quoted here, there are some encounters, and God knows what happens in those encounters. So how do you reconcile, and how do you explain that we still talk about heraldry like the platonic love today?
This is a fantastic question, very important. On Plato, quickly, Finelli is here. In the Kitab al-Zahra, the Book of the Flower, of Ibn Dawood al-Isfahani, is very well known. He says, he has the whole myth of the desire and pursuit of the whole from Plato's Symposium. Aristophanes gives it. They were all divided halves, so they're searching for other whole. So Ibn Dawood gives this story, but his proof text is Jamil. 3 lines of Jamil. It's like, before we had bodies, our souls were connected, even in the cradle, and la la la. So that's the Platonic side. You can find Jamil's stuff that's very, always the critics will call it afif. That's to say chaste. And Udri love is supposed to be chaste. And this is in distinction to the Ghazal poets of the cities, like Al-Ahwas and Omar, who can be very vulgar. And what I will say with my deep dive in Jamil is that we're done with that. Jamil could be totally, he doesn't describe actual intercourse, but it would be very easy for me to describe what what Bothani's body looks like, because I've read 100 descriptions of it, and they're not modest. There's one where it says, from the time at wherever, where her wrapper blew away, I've been in love with Bothina, right? But this is somewhere where, again, I kind of have to pull back. It would be very natural for me to have like a whole critical take informed by gender studies on Udri love. In fact, I have to bite my tongue, but it's not my job to have these opinions. I need to make them available to readers who can then do that. And I think when that happens, and so I think everyone's going to be expecting the translator's introduction to be all about Udri love. I'll give it 2 lines.
Yeah.
But yeah, Udri love is this construction, this confabulation that, again, you don't get a kinship group that way.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Tara. One last demand to satisfy. There's a musical number. You were asking for music.
Yes.
Do we have a little outro music? This is a song from 1999 by Fairuz. Let's see if it works. Lyrics by Jamil Bothani, music by Mohammed Mohsin. And if it works, we'll hear it. The text you wanted to hear until a minute into the song. So there we go. Now we can relax.